Hey guys, welcome back to Gotta Be Geek, where we go through tutorials, dev tools, and host tech talks to help you be a better engineer or developer. And in today's video, I wanted to talk about this year's Microsoft Build event and the sessions or topics that stood out to me. But before we get into the video, I need to talk about today's sponsor. That's right, our sponsor, or I guess I should say sponsors, because there's two. Well, the sponsors are none other than the like button and the subscribe button, both of which are down below, and without them, this channel wouldn't be possible. So, if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe if you aren't already. First up on our list of things that they talked about was winget, the Windows Package Manager. And for any of you that might have already been familiar or have spent a little bit of time working with a Linux distribution like Ubuntu, you may already be familiar with apt-get, which is a command line way to install applications on your computer. And there are other distributions for Linux out there that do, some of them do use apt-get still, and some of them use their own package manager, which I'm not going to get into those today. But for most, apt-get is the go-to way to update, delete, and install applications on a Linux system. So for those of you that are already used to this or that enjoy working in the command line, the Windows Package Manager winget will be a welcome treat for you. Additionally, if you're running a headless Ubuntu server, which is one where you don't have the user interface and your server runs only in a command line scenario, then apt-get is likely the de facto way for you to install packages and stuff on your computer because you don't have access to a user interface like the Ubuntu Software Center to install your applications. I'll have a link in the description below where you can go visit the GitHub repository for winget and follow their instructions for installing winget on your computer. One of the great things about winget is that we can actually use it to talk about our next thing that we want to talk about today, and that's Microsoft PowerToys. Microsoft PowerToys is a great collection of utilities to help with common productivity tasks. More PowerToys may get added in the future, but I'm just going to go over the currently available ones as of this video. The first PowerToy we're going to go over is Fancy Zones, and this is just a really neat way to set up different customized zones where you can put different applications. And I'll have an example here. You can see where I've kind of created 3 different window areas, and I can drag different applications to kind of lock into those areas. So you may already be familiar with some of the default kind of snap-in areas that you can put windows in today, but Fancy Zones just kind of gives you a bit more customization on creating different zones and for any variety of applications, like the example that I have here. So, you know, feel free, go wild, create your own layouts and have fun with Fancy Zones. Next up in our PowerToys list is Shortcut Guide. And so what this does is this is an overlay that you can see different shortcuts that are contextually aware of what's on your desktop at the time. And this may sound kind of fancy, but really it's nothing more than just a kind of reminder of different shortcuts that already exist on your computer today. So if you're not used to using some of these Windows shortcuts, it's helpful to kind of get familiar with them. And it does notice that you have a particular window open, and it will kind of show that window in the box there. But it doesn't really provide anything like unique or extra. It's just a way for you to have a quick way to see what kind of shortcuts you can do. But as far as the contextually aware of what's on your desktop, I didn't really find that this really added anything unique. So I would venture to say that you're probably going to stop using this particular PowerToy after you get used to the Windows shortcuts, if that's something that you're interested in. Going down the list, we have Power Rename. So this allows you to rename a collection of files at one time using things like regular expressions. So if you've ever had a need to rename a set of files that have some sort of common naming structure to them, then now you have a tool to be able to select all of these files and rename and use regular expressions to find and replace various things within the names of those files. Personally, I haven't really ever had any situations where I would probably find this too useful, but for those of you that have needed a tool like this, now you've got one. Next up on our list isn't so much of a new feature as it is an extension on an existing Windows feature, and that's the File Explorer preview. And so this is a checkbox that you can select to have a preview of different files, and this doesn't work for all file types. Common ones that you can see here would be like JPEGs or like text files. You can kind of see what's in the text file without having to actually open it up, or you can see the photo. So in cases like this, you'll be able to see where you might have a list, for those of you that like to have things in a list where you see the details and the date and stuff that you wouldn't see in some of the other kind of thumbnail views or large icon view. So if you like the list or detailed view in File Explorer, but you still want to be able to quickly see what a particular picture is, then you can use this to have this preview pane where you can see what the picture is and just kind of click through, or hit the arrow keys and move through your File Explorer to look at different things. And you can even copy text out of a text document and use it somewhere else. But what the PowerToy kind of edition really does is it allows you to preview SVG files and Markdown files. So you'll see here's an example. I can take some text and I can create a Markdown file, and then I can look and see what that looks like, with which is kind of nice if you have never used Markdown before. It's a nice way to kind of create README documentation and outlines, and a nice way to kind of format with a pretty common language standard. And so if you didn't want to have to use something like GitHub or maybe VS Code to read and use an additional extension in VS Code to be able to read these Markdown files, then this creates a way for you to do that. This next one is probably one that a lot of people have needed tools for in the past and maybe haven't had them or known where to find them, and that's Image Resizer. So in the past, I probably would have just used something like Paint to go through and resize a photo, but it does feel like a bit of an unintuitive way to go do that. So now you kind of have a very direct way, being able to just right-click on a photo, and you just get this nice little image resize option, which is really useful and quick to get to, which is kind of nice, instead of having to figure out that Paint even has this image resizing ability. Or if you also probably wouldn't want to, if you didn't have something like Photoshop or Lightroom, and you didn't want to have to pay for them because it's kind of overkill just to resize a photo, it's a pretty useful tool. Here's a fun one, and that's Keyboard Manager. This allows you to remap various keys and shortcuts to something else. And there's a lot of possibilities here, but there are a few restrictions. You can only map global shortcuts, and app-specific shortcuts are supposedly on the roadmap in the future. And you cannot remap the function key, nor can you remap the Control-Alt-Delete shortcut, as that is reserved for the Windows operating system. Last but not least is PowerToys Run. This is like the original Windows run tool that's activated by the Windows key and the R key shortcut, but this is like the run tool that got an extreme makeover. This is a neat little tool where you can open it up and you can run little calculations in it. You can open up various files right from there in File Explorer, and you can open up various applications and search for different things. So it's pretty neat. My only complaint for this is that I think it's a little bit slow. If you're a keyboard warrior that avoids their mouse like the plague, then this is probably a great little addition for you. Enough of the PowerToys talk. Let's move on to the next major item, and that's the Windows subsystem for Linux version 2 release. So for those of you that may not have known, Windows for a little while now has had the ability to run a Linux subsystem on your PC, and you've been able to choose from a variety of distributions like Kali Linux or CentOS or Ubuntu, and you can have different access to different Linux style commands that you may be familiar with or maybe have missed since you've been on a Windows PC. And so it's been really nice to have that for those that need it for various situations. And the upgrade of 2 comes with a few new features. There is a comparison that they have that I'll put up here, and you can check that out to see what version might be right for you, and I'll include a link to this comparison in the description below. But for most cases, they say that you should use WSL2 unless you have like a very few of these specific cases that they've listed where you'd probably still want WSL1. However, as of this video recording, my PC still wasn't ready for the update required to get WSL2, and it doesn't have any kind of ETA, and you could get access to it earlier if I had enabled an insider build on my computer, but I didn't really feel like going through that, so I figured I'd just wait for the normal stable release. And so I haven't really had a chance to play with this to see any kind of major differences, but I will check it out when it gets here. Moving on to the next topic is Windows Terminal. You may have already noticed in some previous parts of this video, as I was showing examples for some of the other topics, that I had this crazy customized looking terminal thing, and that's the new Windows terminal. This new terminal is open source, which I'll have the link for in the description below, and it's extremely customizable. In my terminal, I have a pretty customized set of split panes where I have PowerShell here on the left, I have command line up on the top right, and WSL1 on the bottom right with a custom logo, with my custom logo actually in the right hand side there as a background. You can also have multiple tabs open, and this is a command line powerhouse, and I found it extremely fun to customize and set this up to my liking. While I don't use command line tools very often outside of VS Code's integrated terminal for various web development projects, I did find that I actually really like the aesthetic of having my own custom terminal with my own logo on a background, so much so that I've actually had this Windows terminal with this split pane setup open on one of my monitors since the Microsoft build event. Next up on our list is VS Code's remote development. And this new tool actually enables quite a lot, but basically what it allows you to do is SSH into remote machines and use your local VS Code to edit the code on those computers, which is really neat, because if you've ever needed to SSH into, say, a Linux server and edit some kind of code or text or whatever on that machine, if it's a headless system, you and your SSH, you don't have access to a user interface, so you have to edit on the command line with something like Vim. So this is a really neat and powerful tool that you get to add to your development arsenal. What's also great about this is that you actually can install the extensions on a remote machine instead of your local VS Code, which means that when you SSH into various machines, say that you have 3 or 4 different remote machines and all of them have different extensions that you need. Maybe one is some computer that you do C# development on, and another one is a Node.js web server. And so you can install extensions relevant to those different machines on those machines, and then when you connect to them, those extensions kind of become active and available in your local VS Code when that connection is live to that computer. And then when you disconnect, you just go back to the setup and the extensions that you have only installed on your local VS Code, which is actually really awesome. There are a few caveats to this. There are some extensions that don't work this way, but you'll see a little option where you can install it on the remote computer when you're connected to it instead of your local one. And so you'll just have to kind of play around with this and see which different extensions will work on your remote machine versus your local VS Code. One of the other really neat things about this is that this enables you to connect to and develop on the Linux subsystem that you may have already enabled on your machine, which is great, because this means if you've ever wanted to test something and run it in Linux, you can do that on your Windows machine without leaving your favorite text editor, which by this point should be VS Code, right? There's some great documentation to help you get started with VS Code's remote development, and I'll have a link for that in the description below, where they also do a really good job of going over the extensions on your local machine versus the remote one, so be sure to check it out. Finally, on to my favorite topic of this whole bunch, the last but definitely not the least, and that is the Azure Static Web Apps. So before the Azure Static Web Apps, you had a few options when you wanted to deploy a website, and the first one, which definitely kind of required most of the setup, and that's a full-fledged VM where you would need to kind of set up and configure the different things to run your web server on there. The second option would be the Azure Web Apps, which is kind of a managed container within an Azure VM, and they kind of handle the VM side of it on the back end, and you just make the web app, and then it kind of scale. You can set it up to scale and manage all on its own. And then the last option is Azure Blob Storage, which has the ability to activate and run a static website and serve it from the Azure Blob Storage. Now, in realistic scenarios, and even including my own website, if you wanted to do the first two scenarios, you're likely to spend anywhere from about $18 a month to maybe even $100 a month, depending on your usage and the scale that you need for your application. Now, there are some cheaper options when it comes to the Azure App Service plans. However, I feel like most people would want to choose the plan that supports SSL certificates. And so if you don't know what that means, basically having an SSL certificate means that your connection is encrypted, so that when people visit your site, they see the little lock icon and it's an HTTPS connection, and so they can feel secure knowing that any communication between them and your website is going to be secure. And if you don't have this, then you see the little warning sometimes saying that the connection is not private, and it's going to make your website seem probably a little unprofessional or maybe even a little scammy. So why is this important? Well, because if you choose to do the SSL certificate option instead of a cheaper option that doesn't, then that bumps you into about the $40 to $50 range. I'm going to skip going over the full-fledged virtual machine options because it requires quite a bit more setup to get your website going on there, and so for most situations it can probably be a little bit overkill for just deploying something like a static website, even though it can be cheaper than the Azure App Service plans that have SSL certificate support. Virtual machines can be really useful though, and there's a lot of situations where you might find them useful, so definitely go and check them out and see if they work for any of your scenarios. But as I said, for this case, if it's just something like a static website, it can probably seem a little bit overkill and the configuration might be a little more than you'd want. So back to that third option of Azure Blob Storage. Well, Azure Blob Storage is actually priced incredibly well, but unfortunately, while you can do a static website with Azure Blob Storage, it doesn't seem to have any option, at least that I could find, and if you know how to do this, feel free to correct me in the comment section below, but I couldn't find any way to bring your own SSL certificate. The only thing I could find to have a secure connection through an Azure Blob Storage static website was to use the Azure Managed SSL certificates, which was a certificate that you had to pay for. And so I didn't really want to pay yearly for a certificate, so this meant either I had to choose the $40 to $50 range Azure App Service plan, or I had to use the cheaper blob storage but then pay a yearly fee for the SSL certificate. And I can't honestly remember what the price for the SSL certificate was at this time. I think it probably actually would have ended up being cheaper to go that route, but I knew in the end I wanted to go the free certificate route, and the option for that was Let's Encrypt, which is a free and open source certificate authority that serves about 200 million websites to date. And one of the things that makes them really secure is because their certificates only ever last 3 months, which means that you have to renew them pretty often in comparison to a yearly certificate or even every couple year certificate that you may do through Azure. So this kind of keeps things a bit secure, and their motto is to kind of be a bit more automated. So there was a neat little automated tool that you could set up on an Azure App Service to encrypt or use Let's Encrypt, and it just automatically goes through and renews or creates a new certificate for me shortly before the old one expires, which is really neat. At the end of this though, I still have two options that end up costing me more money than I probably want to be spending, especially for something as simple as just a static website. So enter Azure Static Web Apps. This comes bundled with the ability to run a static website and a serverless API that you can use Azure Functions to fetch data from various sources of your choosing. I am told too that SSL certificates are supposed to be automatically integrated into Azure Static Web Apps as well, which is great for our use case in this scenario. Small disclaimer though, I have yet to see an actual custom domain pointed at an Azure Static Web App with SSL enabled, so I'm not 100% sure yet if this works as one might expect it to. I've actually spent a pretty significant amount of time since the announcement to redesign my own website to run as an Azure Static Web App, which is a decent part of why it took me so long to get this video out. Shameless plug alert, I am building a merchandise store into my new website, so stay tuned for that video when it comes out. I've only gotten to the point where I've got the site deployed. I haven't gotten to the point where I've pointed my custom domain at my static IP address for my static app to test out the SSL integration that's supposedly baked in. One issue that I did encounter that I'm not entirely sure was a development problem with me or a bug with the whole setup was that when I tried to use a third-party NPM package, in this case Axios, to make web requests, my serverless API just returned a bunch of 500 errors every time I tried to hit the endpoint, and it never had any helpful error messages for me able to figure this out. Once I converted over to using the HTTPS package to make web requests instead, which is a package bundled in with the Node.js runtime, then I stopped having the issue and web requests started working just fine. Either I'm not setting up something correctly, or this is just one of those kind of preview bugs that you might encounter for something this early in the stage. If you have used third-party packages in your Azure Static Web App and serverless API setup, and you know what might be the problem, feel free to comment below and educate me on how to set it up and do it correctly. Also, while they do have documentation that uses something called Live Server, which is an extension for VS Code, to be able to run your function app or your serverless API at the same time as your static web app, to be able to have your static web app call your locally running Azure function serverless API. I couldn't get these two to work in tandem. I could get them both to work individually, and I could run the function locally in VS Code and debug it and hit it, the endpoint, with a tool known as Postman that some of you may be familiar with already, to make sure that everything worked. But I seemingly couldn't get the configuration set up to where I could have both of them running and make sure that it worked. But once I've deployed everything, it seemed to all work fine then. So if you know how to get that working, or you've done it and set that up, feel free to comment below. If it's a GitHub repo, comment it, and feel free to share some instructions, and we'll help everyone else out with this as well. I imagine in this case, though, this is likely just me missing something small in the documentation. So in the future, once I've completed my website redesign and deployment and set everything up, I'll do a follow-up video on that setup and my experiences with it and kind of everything I had gone through. And in that video, I'll probably have a discount code for the first drop of my merchandise with the new merchandise store. So stay tuned for that video if you want to get a discount on any of the items that I'll be releasing in the first drop. Final disclaimer is that the Azure Static Web Apps team did say that this is in preview, so they suggest not moving any production workloads to the Azure Static Web App service just yet, but I like to live a little bit on the edge, so I'm not going to let that stop me personally. Also, if I hadn't mentioned it already, it is completely free, so it is worth it, because now you don't have to pay for the app service plan or the SSL certificates, and everything just comes bundled in, and it's all free. And you can use this with data storage for things like Cosmos DB as well. So you get a static web app, you get API endpoints with Azure Functions, and data storage for things like Cosmos DB on their free tier to query whatever data you want to store. So what else can you ask for? Well, I realize I can actually talk about this stuff a lot longer than I'd originally anticipated, but I'm not planning on stopping these videos anytime soon, so there's going to be plenty of future opportunities for me to get a shorter video out there. I hope that you had an opportunity to watch the build event this year and geek out on it like I did, and if you didn't, hopefully this video provided enough for you to geek out on. If you did watch the build event and I didn't talk about a thing that you thought was really interesting or neat, feel free to tell me about it in the comments section below. That's it for me. I'm going to see you guys in the next one.